To thank you, first of all, for your very constructive engagement with me on this bill. I really welcome that, and I do think it's a very good way, if I may say, a very positive way to approach private members' legislation. And I just want to thank colleagues from all across the House for support for this bill, and to speak a little about the history of the bill and the reason why we brought it forward. The title, or the principal act that we seek to amend, as Section 1 sets out, is indeed the Irish Nationality and Citizenship Act 1956. So I think it's helpful at the outset of committee stage to refer back to why we're seeking to amend that principal act in this legislation, and to perhaps chart a way forward in keeping with that principal act and the framework, the legislative framework that is set out in that act as per Section 1. So, as I've said, it's been wonderful to get such support from across the House, but of course we had support across the House before when we brought this bill. We and the Labour senators brought this bill at second stage in the Seanad on the 21st of November 2018, and at that date it was passed and we had hoped then to make further progress with it. We restored it to the order paper this summer, and indeed we were, I suppose, prompted to do so and to take further action on it in memory of our dear colleague and comrade Cormac O'Brien, who was chairperson of Labour Youth, who died very tragically almost exactly 1 year ago, and who had really been passionately exercised by the need for us to do more for the rights of children born here in Ireland and to secure a pathway to citizenship for those children. And Cormac and I had many conversations about how we would make progress with this very bill. So in his memory, we're bringing it forward. In his memory, Labour Youth, led by Cian Kelly and others, have instituted a great campaign, the Born Here, Belong Here campaign, seeking support from across the country for a more generous approach to citizenship laws. And we're very grateful also for the great support we've had from NGOs working in this area, in particular the Migrant Rights Centre. Mairead McDevitt has been tirelessly campaigning on this in recent weeks and has been emailing and has emailed senators, I know, a very helpful background briefing from the Migrant Rights Centre just yesterday to help in this debate. Also the Immigrant Council of Ireland and Brian Killoran, NASC and Massey, of course, the Movement of Asylum Seekers in Ireland, all of whom are very anxious to see some changes some change in the law in this area. And I should say that our one of the initial motivations for bringing the bill forward in 2018, of course, was the case of Eric Sway, the 9-year-old boy from Bray in County Wicklow, who colleagues will recall had lived all his life in Ireland, had of course been born here, but whose family were then threatened with deportation in 2018. And his classmates in 4th class in St. Cronan's National School in Bray instituted a campaign to enable Eric and his family to stay. It was successful as it turned out. The Minister at the time granted humanitarian leave to remain, as was within the discretion of the Minister. But our concern as Labour members, as Labour parliamentarians who had opposed the citizenship referendum in 2004, our concern was that our law following that referendum had been drafted too restrictively, and that it meant that children who had such a strong stake in Ireland, like Eric, weren't being given any pathway to legal citizenship or any protection against deportation. And so unless they could organise a campaign, unless the Minister was willing to grant this discretionary leave to remain, it would be impossible for them to secure a route to citizenship. So we were anxious to try and provide such a route to citizenship. And colleagues will recall that, of course, the 2004 referendum I referred to inserted the 27th Amendment into the Constitution, amending Article 9. And that's crucial when one looks at Section 1 and the legislation we refer to there, because the text of Article 9(2)(1) of the Constitution, following the 2004 referendum, says that notwithstanding any other provision of this Constitution, a person born in the island of Ireland, which includes its islands and seas, who does not have at the time of the birth of that person at least one parent who is an Irish citizen or entitled to be an Irish citizen, is not entitled to Irish citizenship or nationality unless provided for by law. And of course that final clause, Minister, is the clause that enables or empowers the Oireachtas to legislate for citizenship entitlements, up to and including citizenship by virtue of birthplace or lus soli citizenship based on the place of birth. In fact, however, the Oireachtas following that referendum, which, as I say, Labour opposed, we believed we should have retained our right to citizenship on birth, the lus soli, or birthright citizenship. But following that referendum's passage, the legislation that was passed, the 2004 Irish Nationality and Citizenship Act, which amends that Principal Act referred to in Section 1, the 1956 Act. The 2004 Act effectively denied children born in Ireland an automatic right to citizenship by virtue of birthplace. And what we see in the framework, the legislative framework, since under that Principal Act, the 1956 Act, but following 2004 in particular, what we see, I suppose, is a very generous citizenship law where it comes to lus sanguinis, the old idea of birthright citizenship by bloodline rather than place of birth. So someone who has a parent who is an Irish citizen or entitled to be one is entitled to apply for Irish citizenship whether or not they were born or indeed resident in Ireland. And we do have, as I say, generous laws on that basis. But what we lack now is that sort of generosity of approach when it comes to children born here in Ireland. And what it has meant in practice, the outcome of the, not so much of the referendum itself, which simply removes the constitutional provision entitling citizenship by virtue of birthplace, but more by virtue of the subsequent legislation. What we've seen, therefore, is that children who've been born in Ireland, who've grown up here, who've known no other home but here, and who are effectively stateless if they don't have Irish citizenship, that they are being threatened with deportation along with their families. So what we've seen is that deportations can and have taken place at the end of lengthy immigration or asylum application processes that can take years to determine, years in which a child is born, raised and educated here. But we don't need another referendum to reverse this or to I suppose, address this situation for this small number of children and their families. Because, as I say, the 2004 referendum amendment gives the Oireachtas exclusive power to legislate for citizenship pathways. And many of those who first supported that referendum in 2004 have agreed that this sort of legislation is required, that some way to enable people, children born here and their families, to have a pathway to citizenship should be provided for in law. And I'm sure our colleague and friend, Senator Michael McDowell, won't mind me quoting his speech on this bill at second stage on 21st November 2018, when he said, "I support this bill. It should be given a second reading. It is well intentioned and addresses an aspect of our current law which needs to be addressed by the Oireachtas." And he went on to say, "I believe the bill is timely and appropriate, and there has to be a mechanism for children in these circumstances," referring to circumstances like that of young Eric, "to enter into a process where discretion will be exercised rather than just sit in a limbo for years, wondering if a knock will ever come at the door. That is not appropriate, and it is the situation that Senator Lawless," and he's referring to then Senator Billy Lawless, "is dealing with in America. It is unjust and inhuman, and we have to provide for it." And he then said, and he had spoken about being the architect of the 2004 referendum, he said, "The effect of that referendum was to vest in the Houses of the Oireachtas total responsibility for our citizenship laws, to deal with it in any way it likes. That is not mean-minded but democratic." So I think it is important to emphasise the power of the Oireachtas within the terms of the Constitution to provide for legislation of the sort that we're seeking to bring forward today. And I do, as I say, Minister, welcome your support for progressing the legislation further. And I should also quote from the current Taoiseach, who responded to my party leader, Alan Kelly, on the 12th of November in the Dáil about this bill, saying that he would see what he could do, that we have found solutions to these issues in the past. And I quote, "Only last year we brought in a scheme to regularise people who came here on a student visa, whose student visa lapsed and who ended up in the workforce. This is pretty much what happens to the undocumented Irish in America." And he goes on to say, "Perhaps we can come up with a scheme to facilitate these young people as well." And he's talking about allowing people to apply for a regularised status. That's Taoiseach Varadkar just speaking a few weeks ago. And as I say, I do also very much welcome very positive comments that were made about this legislation by the Seanad leader, Senator Regina Doherty, and by the Deputy Leader, Senator Lisa Chambers, and indeed by my Green Party colleagues here in the House. And indeed Fianna Fáil and the Greens had supported the bill at second stage in November 2018. So just briefly to say, how then would our bill, if it were passed, change things and change the regime as set out in the Principal Act and the amending legislation? Well, It would make 3 key changes to our naturalisation regime. And of course, remembering that naturalisation is also covered in this bill. It's not just about citizenship, and that's made clear in the title and section 1. So the 3 changes are that first, as we know, normally someone applying for naturalisation must have a period of 1 year's continuous residence in the state immediately before date of application, plus a total residence of at least 4 of the 8 immediately preceding years. And our bill would, just in the case of an Irish-born child, change that 4-year requirement to 2 years, effectively replacing a 5-year residency with the 3-year residency requirement. Secondly, we would lift the requirement that the parent or guardian of the minor of the child must satisfy eligibility criteria. So we're seeking to ensure that the child's status is the determinant for an application for citizenship. And finally, in calculating a period of residence, Minister, as we know, under the current legislative framework, periods of residence where the person was supposed to have permission to remain but did not have permission, or where it was for a temporary purpose, these are disregarded. But our bill would lift that requirement, again, just in the case of an Irish-born child. So we believe that this bill, a modest bill, represents a sensible and compassionate approach to regularising the position of Irish-born children who have spent years of their childhood resident in this country, but who currently face an uncertain future and even threat of deportation. And we know from more recent surveys since 2004, indeed from a 2018 Behaviour and Attitudes poll, that over 70% of people believe that those born in Ireland should be entitled to citizenship. I should say I've had some I've had great correspondence that's very supportive of the legislation, but some correspondence suggesting that the current legislation reflects a more European-wide practice or framework for enabling citizenship and naturalisation. And I would just say in response to that there's a very helpful document just produced in July of 2020 by the European Migration Network called Pathways to Citizenship for Third Country Nationals in the EU. And I'm very grateful to Chloe Manahan, my assistant in the Shannon, who brought it to my attention, because it's really useful as a guide to what are European-style laws for citizenship. And of course, the first thing in the document is to point out that the conditions of acquisition and loss of citizenship fall within the remit of national competence. So it is in fact a matter for each national government of each member state. And Ireland has sovereignty, or we have our sovereignty over our own citizenship law. So there is no EU legal template as such. And indeed, all member states do offer the possibility for third country nationals to acquire citizenship through ordinary naturalisation, but the rules regulating this process differ across countries. And there's a very helpful guide to the sort of rules that apply. In some countries, residency requirements of from 3 years up to as long, in some cases, as 10 years. Some countries have special provisions for children born in the country to parents neither of whom are nationals, which is essentially the sort of provision we're seeking to introduce. And some countries provide citizenship on an unconditional lus soli basis for specified groups of individuals born on the territory at predefined times, such as of interest, because I think there's a general rule, there is a perception that's not the case. So in fact, Luxembourg and Malta do have some unconditional lus soli provisions or birthright of place provisions. So I thought, Minister, I'm conscious I've spoken for a good deal of time on Section 1, but it's hugely important to set out the context for the bill and the reason why we bring it forward and the reason why we're seeking to amend that principal act referred to in Section 1, the Irish Nationality and Citizenship Act, and why we're seeking to amend further legislation subsequent to the referendum. But this is a bill that's entirely within the terms of the referendum. It's not seeking to in any way be undemocratic or to rewrite the referendum. The referendum and the 27th Amendment clearly give the Oireachtas the power to legislate. And I thought I would, just before I sit down, just to say that the Migrant Rights Centre have provided us with some testimonials from parents affected by the current citizenship laws and by the absence of a clear pathway to legal citizenship here. And one testimonial written by a parent whose daughter was born and raised in Ireland simply says this: "My 5-year-old daughter was born in Ireland. She's now going to primary school here. She's a bubbly, fun and creative person. She says, 'I was born in Ireland. This is my country.' She doesn't know any other home than here. She is very smart. When she grows up, she wants to be a teacher and a dancer. I hope that dream will come true for her. This bill would be a dream come true for my daughter and our family, because it will help us live without fear and mean she has a bright future." And he or she, the parent, goes on to say, I see the impact of growing up undocumented and I worry about the effect this is having on her. It breaks my heart every day. That's just one of the testimonials, Minister. I've heard from others, including one man whose 3 children have been born here and are going to school here, and to preschool, and about whom I've written to you separately, but who says that, again, he just wants to see his children happy, not live the life as we are now, and to be allowed to stay in Ireland because we feel safe here, and his children are at home here. So I think, there's a clear need for us, and I think it's been acknowledged by the Taoiseach and by government spokespeople in this House. There's a clear need for us to address the situation of undocumented children in Ireland in keeping with the spirit of born here, belong here. So, I really am delighted that you're to have your engagement. I look forward to working with you and your officials. I know we have an agreement that we'll meet over coming weeks, and that then early in the new year we'll have government time to progress this bill further at committee stage. We'll hope to adjourn committee stage today at just after 5 o'clock. But I look forward to engaging with other colleagues too across the House on ways to make progress with this important legislation.
Thank you, Senator Elise.